Disgraced Archbishop Theodore McCarrick is facing a Vatican trial for sex abuse before the Vatican Summit on Abuse begins in February. What does the timing mean? Robert Royal from the Catholic Thing and the Catholic news agency's Ed Condon will provide analysis. And later, where does border security and the government shutdown stand after the president's appeal to the nation this week? Congressman Sean Duffy joins us with analysis. And finally, what should you know about the financial markets in 2019 to get the most out of your investments? Financial expert and Ave Maria fund manager Jorge Schwartz weighs in and talks about his new book on morally responsible investing. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Happy New Year. Robert Royal, Ed Condon, Congressman Sean Duffy, and Jorge Schwartz are all straight ahead. Send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. I'll be live tweeting throughout. Here's some news from the world over. Recent media reports suggest that a trial of Archbishop Theodore McCarrick is underway, and Vatican sources have told the Catholic news agency that his case is not being handled by a full judicial process. Sources at the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith have confirmed that allegations against McCarrick are being considered through an abbreviated approach called an administrative penal process. This indicates that the Catholic Church is moving quickly towards sentencing the cleric. The former prominent Archbishop of Washington, who now stands accused of sexually abusing 3 minors and harassing adult priests and seminarians, already has become the first U.S. cardinal ever removed from office due to sexual misconduct allegations. Now he faces the prospect of being laicized. And the Vatican has confirmed that Argentinian Bishop Gustavo Zanchetta, who resigned suddenly in July of 2017 for health reasons and whose resignation was accepted by Pope Francis, is now under investigation. 3 priests in his diocese of Oran claim that he sexually abused a dozen seminarians. They filed a report with the Apostolic Nuncio. Francis elevated Zanchetta to bishop in 2013 of his own initiative, bypassing all canonical procedure. After accepting his resignation, the Pope created a position for him as assessor of the Holy See's financial administration. According to the Vatican, the allegations against Zanchetta only emerged in recent months. Here with their analysis is the editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and member of the Papal Posse, and D.C. Bureau Chief of the Catholic News Agency, Ed Condon. Thank you both for joining me, gentlemen. Bob, pleasure. I'll just give you a salute. You're too far away to reach. I want to start with the canon law story we reported earlier, that McCarrick is being subjected to what's being called an administrative penal appeal. Now, Ed, you've dealt with these cases. What does that mean in actuality?
So an administrative penal process is something that exists in canon law and is used very frequently. Okay. What happens is if there's a criminal case, or what looks to be a criminal case, a credible allegation, you do a preliminary investigation, and it turns up so much evidence that it looks like a full-blown trial is unnecessary and would just spin the process out, then you can move to an administrative penal process. Now, this is a really stripped-down version of a trial. It's not even a trial, properly speaking. But there are assessors involved to help the judge make a determination. There's still the right of defense. So in this case, Archbishop McCarrick himself will be able to look at the evidence against him, as will his canon lawyer, and make arguments. But we're looking at something that's going to proceed along a much more accelerated timeline.
Bob, do you think that accelerated timeline may be attributable to that upcoming February summit on sexual abuse? The Vatican wants to say, well, look, we took care of McCarrick. And is that the proper way to handle something like this?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we've been all calling for, and our bishops also have been calling for action, that the Holy See not only do something, but be seen to be doing something. So insofar as that's the case, I think that this is good. But there are, of course, doubts about whether you settle the question by expediting it before a meeting so you can be seen to have done something. In my estimation, there probably is enough evidence against McCarrick of all different sorts that he will eventually be found guilty. And it's a good thing, just in general terms, that there'll be this marker sort of laid down there. But I think there are going to be a lot of ongoing questions. And then, of course, there's still the other big questions of how did he manage to survive for so long with all this material in the file at the Congregation for Bishops, and who is responsible for that?
Well, and Ed, this begs the larger question. Even if they convict, let's say they convict McCarrick next Wednesday of these crimes, which she is alleged to have committed, both against minors as well as seminarians, does this then put to rest the viga charges of the way that McCarrick proceeded through the hierarchy, and will that investigation kind of either be forgotten or shelved?
I think they're really separate issues and they need to be treated separately. The criminal conduct of sexual abuse that Archbishop McCarrick stands accused of is something that needs its own treatment. I think trying to conflate the two with how Archbishop McCarrick rose to become an archbishop and eventually a cardinal is a separate question that needs to be dealt with at a separate time. I think when you're dealing with a criminal trial, whether it's canonically or civilly, it's important that that be given its own process and seen in its own terms.
If McCarrick is convicted, do you believe that this then puts the Pope in a good light, that he's moved expeditiously, he's demanding justice, and he's subjecting this archbishop to the full penalties the Church allows?
Well, I mean, yes, in the sense that I just mentioned, that at least steps are now, we can see steps being taken, and we know that something has got to happen. It just can't be played out. McCarrick is very old. I mean, we don't know how much time he has left on this earth, but something has got to happen while he's still alive, because once he dies, this is all going to be ancient history, and people aren't going to feel a sense of urgency. I think that Ed is exactly right, that they're two separate things, but we shouldn't let this good move, this good public move, and then also the follow-up of the meeting in February. We shouldn't let this deflect us from what needs to be a larger investigation into what's been going on.
Ed, how does the sentencing work? It's my understanding, Cardinal Mueller, sitting where you are, it shocked me when he said only the Pope can allow these penalties to proceed against a bishop. The Pope has that purview and power to himself. I assume the congregation or the CDF could enact those penalties. Apparently they can't.
No, absolutely not. And this is entirely correct. I mean, this is a lot of what we've seen with some of the frustrations with how the bishops in the United States have been unable to proceed is bishops aren't accountable to other bishops. The church is a hierarchy. It's a living hierarchy. And in the end, a bishop answers to the Pope. Now, only the Pope can make a determination about a bishop. Only the Pope can open an investigation or a penal process into a bishop. And in the structure of the church, that's as it should be. So also, only a pope can impose penalties on a bishop. Now, in the case of Archbishop McCarrick, what's interesting is this. How will any resolution come out? What charges is he facing? We have a rough idea of the accusations against him, but how they've been formulated, we're not sure. If he's convicted, on what charges will he be convicted? And if he's sentenced and a penalty is imposed, who's imposing it? So while only the Pope has the authority to laicize, for example, a bishop, he can delegate that power to the CDF. Now, will the CDF be acting on delegated power to impose a penalty, or will the penalty be imposed in the name of the Pope himself? And that can make a big difference.
And Bob, we've seen, in fact, Cardinal Mueller alluded to the fact that there were certain friends of the Pope or in his orbit, or friends of friends in the Pope's orbit, that were spared penalty, or their investigations were muted or brought to a close. Are we concerned that we might see that again, or is this, because it's so public now, is this forcing almost a reform within the Curia itself?
Well, I think we can hope for that. I think that this case is just so flagrant.
Explosive.
And it's clear that this is going on for a number of years. This isn't just one instance where a bishop steps off the curb or he's done a number of things that cause a pope to remove him from office. This goes so deep and it has such long roots that I think we can't help but want to see this investigation go further. I don't know if this is going to lead to some questioning of what's going on in Rome, but it certainly ought to, because if I were the Pope, I would like to know around me who might have been involved in what's a very damaging process, that allowing a person that was known, I mean, we've talked about this before on the show, was known for many years to have the beach house, and there were these rumors about seminarians, to have that for so many years, and yet it did not rise to the level of causing any problem of stopping his advance up the hierarchy. I think we've got to get to the bottom of that.
I want to move on to another case beyond McCarrick, because this is an international crisis. We see this story in Argentina. I mentioned it a moment ago about this Bishop Zanchetta, who a group of three priests have come forward and said there were a dozen seminarians they're charging that were sexually abused by this bishop. Now, the curious thing here is he resigned from his post. The Pope made him assessor of the Vatican's finances. And now the Vatican has egg on its face, and Pope himself, because he basically found safe harbor for this man. Now he's not executing his duties while he faces trial. Is this another black mark against the Pope as he tries to face this crisis, since he's personally involved?
His name is personally involved in the sense that it's the Pope who appoints bishops, and it's the Pope who moves them to the Curia. Now, one thing that we have seen, not just under this Pope, but under previous popes, is they're not necessarily given a full understanding of who they're appointing when someone comes up for a job in the Vatican. We've seen other cases where a sanitized version of somebody's resume is put on the Pope's desk and everything looks well. So I think it would be irresponsible to conclude that this is something the Pope is personally responsible for, knowingly involving himself with someone who's got outstanding accusations. But it does cast a further shadow over the Vatican's handling of senior clergy who seem to have accusations outstanding against them. That is something that does need to be addressed.
There's another case in Argentina of two priests at a monastery also charged. One of them abusing a former student in the community who was a minor at the time. The abuse started in 2009, continued to 2015. This is in the Pope's home diocese.
Yeah, I would disagree slightly with you, Ed, in this sense, that the Pope knew Zanchetta, I guess we're calling it because it's a Spanish pronunciation, Zanchetta, because he was, I think, a undersecretary for the Bishops' Conference in Argentina. And so when shortly after, I think it was July, he was elected, the Pope was elected in March, and it was already in July that he appointed this man. It seems that he knew him personally. Now, that said, this doesn't mean that he knows everything.
He knows everything about him.
A lot of bishops knew Archbishop McCarrick personally and had no idea what he was up to.
But the fact that during a hiring freeze at the Vatican, that the Pope made a special position for this man at the administration of the patrimony of the Holy See. This is not the Vatican Bank. This is the organization that runs the real estate, the accounts of religious orders, et cetera. This is a pretty sensitive, powerful position. The fact that he put him in there, he must have felt that the man was a good man and that he needed some sort of place to land. But we have to say, should he be consulting maybe with other people when he makes appointments like that?
I want to move on to the United States bishops ending their retreat this week. The Pope asked them to have a retreat before this February summit to pray together, to discern together what should be done in the midst of this crisis. He sent a letter to them. Much of it is very pastoral. It's really an extended reflection. It goes on for 8 pages. At the top, he said, I suggested that together you make a retreat, a time of seclusion, prayer, and discernment as a necessary step toward responding in the spirit of the gospel to the crisis of credibility that you are experiencing as a church. When I read that, the "you" jumped out at me. This is something that we are experiencing as a church. And I will say a couple of bishops reached out and thought that was a curious omission, considering this is a global crisis, as we've been relating.
It is a global crisis, but there is a particular crisis of credibility facing the American hierarchy right now. I mean, this was palpable during the recent Bishops' Conference meeting in Baltimore, and this is the source of a lot of frustration that they were unable to reach any kind of conclusion at the end of it. So I don't know. I think the Pope was addressing the American church, the American bishops particularly, and there needs to be a particular address there. One thing I really liked about the Pope's letter to the American bishops, and I liked about the tone of this retreat, was he emphasized personal conversion and avoiding the temptations of compromise. I think that's something that we need to see more of. A controversial opinion I have that isn't shared with everyone, but I think that the Pope actually has taken the right steps with regards to this pastoral letter and insisting on a week-long retreat for the bishops. A lot of people are looking for the U.S. bishops and for the Vatican to come up with some sort of new structure and reinvent the procedural wheel to bring bishops to account. I think a lot of what we've seen in the last year, which has seen scandal after scandal in this country and abroad, is a result of human error and human failing. People not doing what they were supposed to do, not following procedures that were already in place. And I think until there's a level of personal accountability for that, we're not going to see real change.
Bob.
Yeah, I think that's true with regard to priests. I'm not so sure about the bishops. I still have questions, and of course no one has any simple answer for how we hold bishops accountable. But there seems to be some failure here in the United States. There seems to be similar failures in Argentina, in in Chile, in Ireland, in Australia. There seems to be a structural problem here. And I want to say again, I don't have any particular insight into how you solve that structural problem, but the mere fact of people being encouraged to be more faithful to their vows, to do their jobs, to be responsible for the people that are under them, all this is very good. But I don't think that it's sufficient to dealing with a problem. I think we're going to have to look deeper.
I don't know. I'd take issue with that slightly. The National Review Board in this country issued a letter in August, sort of in the middle of everything going wrong, the Pennsylvania grand jury report, the McCarrick scandal, everything else. And they said that no new process or structure is going to solve what's caused these crises. And they said what it is it's a crisis. It's a cultural crisis within the American hierarchy. And I think you can apply that slightly more widely. This is a crisis of personal responsibility. And you cannot legislate or reform away personal failings.
But Ed, you brought it up. I want to bring this back in perspective because I think the audience is thoroughly confused by all of it. They hear canonical reforms and expedited trials. It's a blizzard of information to them they can't process. But you hit it on the head very early on when you said, at the end of the day, only the Pope can discipline a bishop. Only the Pope can allow a penalty to be exacted upon and delivered upon a bishop. That said, why are we having this summit in February? This is a papal prerogative. The Pope and the Curia have it within the reach, and you as a canon lawyer know, the canonical process, I'm not one, but many esteemed ones have told me, the canonical process is here, Raymond. It's all here.
Yes.
All you have to do is turn it on, and then the Pope does what he needs to do. So why are we going through this February summit?
I think we don't know what they're going to do in the February summit.
Well, we have some indications, which we're going to talk about.
We have some indications, but one thing that is clear to me is you're absolutely right in what these other people have said to you about the canonical process is there. I would agree with that, and it does need to be turned on. One thing that the canonical process currently lacks is there are gaps carved out in the universal law of the church regarding, for example, clerical discipline, ways in which you would articulate more fully sexual misconduct and how to handle it in a diocese. Now, those are deliberately carved out in the Code of Canon Law so to make room for particular law in individual dioceses, because problems in one place aren't the same as problems in another. And so this was deliberately done. But what we haven't seen a lot of in the last 30 years in the church is bishops taking the initiative and filling in those gaps, which the law expressly encourages them to do.
And allows.
And so what I'm hoping we'll see come out of the February meeting is bishops coming back, not with some big fix from Rome, but feeling emboldened and saying, Rome's on our side. If we want to push the envelope here and start taking firm action, we can do it.
Bob, during the holidays, Cardinal Cupich came out, who's one of the organizers, the Archbishop of Chicago, of this summit. He says this is expressly to protect minors from sexual abuse. Is that too narrowly casting the problem and the question?
Well, it seems that that's what Rome regards the February meeting as. I think a lot of us in the United States had hoped that there would be some sort of practical outcome of what's going to happen. And from everything that I see, the people that I trust most who seem to have some insight and sources in Rome, what they're trying to do is broaden a general awareness of how to protect young people and other vulnerable people, which is a good thing to do, of course. Here in the United States, I think we can say, in spite of all of our problems, that we're a little bit further advanced on that particular problem than probably most other parts of the world are. Ever since 2002 with the Dallas Charter, we've had a pretty, in some cases, I think, overly draconian set of rules about priests who have committed crimes of one sort or another, or sins of one sort or another. I think that the Vatican is looking at this, and Andrea Tornielli, who's now the editorial director of the Vatican News Services, talked about the universality of the church and how the church needs to respond in a universal way, which, of course, is important. What we want to talk about is the spiritual roots that inspire all the ways that we behave, including about these sorts of problems. But I think that there is a little bit of a disconnect for us in America, where we feel that the dealing at the level of priests is one thing, but we're looking for something else. And perhaps Ed is right that we come out emboldened, and maybe our bishops can come back. I've been saying this all along. I hope that they come back and they feel that now that they can begin to do something that on a concrete level. And we've had proposals. I mean, even Cupich has had a proposal.
Ed, you just wrote a piece about this in the Washington Post. Fine piece. I want to read what Tornielli said and then get your reaction to this. He said in a statement, which article he posted on the Vatican website, the purpose of the meeting is very specific: to ensure that everyone taking part in it can return to their own country being absolutely clear about what must and must not be done with regard to addressing these cases. Does that put a fine enough point on what this summit is about?
Not yet.
Yeah.
What are these cases? One of the things, and the McCarrick case highlights this very, very clearly, is you have two distinct levels of crimes that he's accused of. One is the abuse of minors. Now, I don't think you can find anyone who's going to say you can act too strongly or too swiftly or too universally against the abuse of minors. That's more or less a settled issue.
Right.
But you mentioned vulnerable adults, and I think this is going to be an important question, whether it's addressed or not in February, and how. What is a vulnerable adult? Right now in the church's law, a vulnerable adult is someone who habitually lacks the use of reason, essentially someone who has developmental disabilities. But a lot of people say, and they're right, that this wouldn't cover seminarians abused by their bishop or by a priest. This doesn't cover someone who's subject to coercive use of authority. The law doesn't cover them yet. Now, people like Cardinal O'Malley in Boston, Marie Collins, of an abuse survivor and former member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, has said, broaden this definition out. Make it include these people who have been the victim of abuse of authority as well as sexual abuse. So whether or not they're willing to deal with those cases, I think will make a great deal of difference. If they don't, and this is something I mentioned in my piece in the Washington Post and also in Catholic News Agency, is that if they don't address both, then they're going to have a problem. If McCarrick's charges are not answered both, then they're going to have a problem. You need to put this to rest. Otherwise, we're going to look at the church possibly just storing up a next generation of scandals.
And this touches on what Cardinal Brandmuller is now speaking about, which is that the preponderance of these cases of abuse tend to be homosexual in nature. Now, he says that needs analysis. But given the pronouncements coming from the Vatican, it doesn't seem that's on the radar.
Well, we'll see what comes out of this. I mean, these are sort of general statements that are being made primarily to lower
expectations and put walls on this thing.
It's 3 or 4 days. It's, I think, literally hundreds of people, many of whom maybe have never even met one another. The problem in Africa is different than the problem in Asia, than the problem in Latin America or North America. So
it's starting to feel like a therapeutic session where we are appraised of, or the bishops are appraised of the feelings and the wounds delivered upon the victims in this abuse. And that is an important part of this. But Ed makes the other point. So what do you do about it? What do you do about it? But I don't think the bishops need to know you can't touch a child, a woman, or a man. You don't do that sexually. You cannot engage with them in those on that level. Why is that such a mind-blowing concept?
Well, I don't know that that's what the bishops need to be told in Rome.
Apparently somebody needs to be told because it's happening.
Well, but again, we're back to this is a crisis of personal accountability, not a crisis of structure. And I think
it is where bishops are concerned, though, by your own admission.
Well, no, again, we're not talking about a crisis of structure even there, because we have instances looking at McCarrick that, as we said, something was known. People knew. People complained for years about him. And somehow this didn't make its way to the point where the Pope, in this case...
Well, even after settlements, the man was promoted.
Exactly.
This is the problem.
But to say that the problem there lies with the Pope, I think, is to miss the point. That's, again, a personal accountability failure below the Pope, because...
it's in the Curia.
Who is passing these allegations on? Where are they going? We know that, for example, Father Boniface Ramsey received a letter from the Secretary of State saying that his allegations had been received. And they'd had them for years when they wrote to acknowledge
them. Was it 2006?
2006, I think they were acknowledged. What happened in the interim? Why didn't they go to the Pope? Again, these aren't structural problems. There was a process. A letter was sent to the nuncio. The nuncio forwarded it to the Secretary of State. It went to the Congregation of Bishops. Why didn't anything happen there? That's a personal problem. That's not a structural problem.
Bob?
Yeah, but I also think that around the edges, people are trying to look at least adjustments to what the structures are. Even Cardinal Cupich, as I was saying earlier, came up with this idea of the metropolitan sort of overseeing local bishops at the bishops' meeting after the Holy Father had requested that our bishops in the United States not vote on the 2 proposals that they had about personal responsibility and structural reform. So there's a sense that, if personal responsibility is really the key problem, nevertheless, there have to be channels, maybe not restructuring in canonical terms, but there have to be channels by which calls for personal responsibility are going to be available that are effective even for bishops.
Well, in that point, Cardinal Cupich actually mentioned in Baltimore that he wasn't creating this idea out of thin air. In fact, this is something the bishops committed themselves to doing already as part of the Statement of Episcopal Accountability at the signing of the Dallas Charter.
Yeah, back in
that they were already supposed to be referring accusations they received against themselves to another bishop in the metropolitan area. This is, again, something that has already been put in place mechanically, but no one's doing it.
No one's acting on it. Yeah, so it may as well not be there if they're not acting on it.
But
So
having a new process isn't going to solve that problem. It won't touch the underlying problem, which is that people need to take personal responsibility. If a letter lands on their desk, they need to act on it. And I'm afraid that's something that hasn't happened, but maybe we will start seeing to happen, because we're now seeing bishops coming under heavy fire if it comes out that they were told and they didn't act.
Well, I think that's one thing that we can hope comes out of Rome in the February meeting. If there really is a sense of urgency, this is the way I've constantly put it, a sense of urgency backed by the Holy Father himself, that people go out and understand that they've got to make it work, then I think the individual national bishops' conferences can go out and do what needs to be done in their own territories in the right way for the cultures in which they exist. But that means that Rome really is going to have to embolden them, to use that word, embolden them to go out and do the right thing.
before I let you all go, on January 1st, the Pope was at the Angelus, and at the end of the Angelus, he did something which he has done in the past. He did not do the traditional blessing. He decided to recite an Old Testament blessing. You had a thought or two on this one.
Well, Raymond, you remember when we covered the conclave. 3 days later, he had a meeting for all the journalists. There were 6,000 of us sitting in the Aula Palisesto, and he did the exact same thing, and it really took us all aback because when you're Pope, there's always somebody in the room that isn't necessarily a believer, and even it may be a room full of cardinals. You don't necessarily have people who are believers. So it's an odd thing that he does. One understands why he does it. He tries to be more universal,
he's trying to,
and try to reach out on New Year's Day to the entire world. But I think if you're the Pope of Rome, you make a Trinitarian prayer on the feast of Mary, the Mother of God.
Okay, Ed.
I don't know. The Pope sometimes makes these, I don't know if they're spontaneous gestures, but these deviations. And the bottom line is the purpose of the Pope issuing a blessing to the city and the world is that the world takes notice. We've taken notice.
We'll leave it there. Bob, Ed, thank you both for your insight. You can find Robert Royal's commentary at thecatholicthing.org, and all of Ed Condon's reporting is at thecatholicnewsagency.com. Congressman Sean Duffy is next, but first, a little news to share with you. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reaffirmed the U.S.'s commitment to the Middle East and the ongoing battle against ISIS during a news conference in Egypt on Thursday. Pompeo is in talks with Egyptian leaders on a 9-country Middle East tour that seeks to reassure leaders in the region after the president recently announced the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria. The president also delivered a primetime address from the Oval Office on Tuesday, calling for Congress to dedicate $5 billion for his border wall. Trump called the situation a growing humanitarian and security crisis, and he urged Democrats to fund border security and end the partial government shutdown. On Wednesday, President Trump walked out of a meeting with Democrat leaders Senator Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi after they refused to compromise on border security spending, continuing the partial shutdown. The president has threatened to declare a national emergency to build the wall if Congress does not act. Joining us now to talk about all of this and much more, I'm joined by the House Financial Services Committee member and U.S. Congressman from Wisconsin, Sean Duffy, the man now refilling Maxine Waters' water
glass.
So
Maxine is our new chair of Financial Services. We're going to get a lot of work done in that committee.
Okay.
A lot of investigations maybe and a lot of impeachment talk, but I don't know how much on actual financial services
well,
legislation.
we will check in with you throughout the year to see how that relationship is developing.
Stay tuned.
The president made the case for border security on Tuesday night from the Oval Office. Here's what he had to say.
The only thing that is immoral is the politicians to do nothing and continue to allow more innocent people to be so horribly victimized. How much more American blood must we shed before Congress does its job? When I took the oath of office, I swore to protect our country, and that is what I will always do.
How effective do you think this message was in reaching the American people?
Well, let's first be clear. The liberal media and the Democrats are messaging together. And they're putting pressure on President Trump to open up the border, and folks aren't getting paychecks, and there's not a crisis at the border, it's manufactured. And it's important that President Trump, he's a one-man band in regard to messaging, that he go out and talk about the importance of border security, not just for the American people. So we have, you know this, we have drugs, meth and heroin, 90% of it comes over the southern border, ravaging communities like mine in Wausau, Hudson, Superior. But we have MS-13 gang members and other criminals. 17,000 migrants with criminal records were caught at the border last year alone. 17,000. That doesn't count the people we didn't catch. So a huge number of people with criminal convictions are coming into the United States. But not only that, 400 people who made that very dangerous journey died last year alone. 400 people. And as the president mentioned in the address, a third of women are sexually assaulted. That's a number that comes from Doctors Without Borders.
Yeah.
So not only do you have a crisis for the migrants with an open border that incentivizes them to make a 2,000-mile journey to our border, but also we have the security and safety concerns that we have inside of our country. And so I think the president is right on. And listen, I don't know that he's the best, scripted and where he can't deviate from the teleprompter and he's sitting down. So he's better in other formats, but you know what? You sit in the Oval Office. Everyone has a Twitter account. Only one guy has an Oval Office. And that he uses it, I thought was important.
I want to play this for you. Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Leader Chuck Schumer responded to the president's address. Here's some of what they had to say.
The president is rejecting these bipartisan bills which would reopen government over his obsession with forcing American taxpayers to waste billions of dollars on an expensive and ineffective wall.
President Trump has appealed to fear, not facts, division, not unity. There's an obvious solution. Separate the shutdown from arguments over border security.
What's wrong with that argument?
Well, first off, Democrats spent almost $1 trillion on an infrastructure bill 10 years ago that didn't build any infrastructure. This is $5 billion that will secure our border. So and they're talking about money. I don't buy that argument, number one. But number two, walls work, and that's why Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama have all voted for border funding in the past. And so when they say, hey, listen, this is a waste of money, well, why did Chuck Schumer vote for the Secure Fence Act in 2006? And why did he vote for a plan in 2013 to give us fencing and border wall at the southern border if it didn't work? The truth, Raymond, is the fact that Democrats know walls work. They want border security. The problem is they hate the president, and the president ran on border security. They don't want to give him a win. They just want to resist him. Now, with that said, there was a lot of debate about whether Nancy and Chuck were able to give an address to the nation after President Trump, because this was somewhat political.
Right.
I thought it was brilliant. I come from Wisconsin, a relatively 50-50 seat. And the more that Chuck and Nancy from San Francisco and New York can talk to my constituents, the more middle America sees that they're out of touch.
I have to say, I thought the real coup here was not that President Trump sat behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office, which was fine. The real coup was that he drew Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer into that very bizarre long hallway. They almost looked like something. They looked like those two little girls in The Shining. Come play with us. Come play with us. It had the staging of it was peculiar, and they're sharing the podium. Couldn't they have had two podiums? We couldn't afford two.
Right.
But anyway, I'm getting into theatrics. But the reality here is compromise possible, given that the president really believes, and I should say, I was at this off-the-record luncheon with the president.
You were?
This
Okay,
week
good.
With these anchors. There were like, I don't know, 13
Were you
of us
the
around
leak?
table. I was not the leak.
Good to hear.
I have suspicions of who the leaker was.
It wasn't you.
It was somebody at that table, this is like Clue, somebody at that table leaked to the New York Times. But I can tell you it wasn't Brett Baer or me.
Okay.
Or David Brody. I can assure you it wasn't those three people. But what I got from that, without revealing anything, the president is entrenched on this issue. He is not going to move because he does believe that this border wall is needed for national security. And I do believe, talking to friends of mine who work in the Democratic caucus, that the Nancy Pelosi staff believes this would be a political win for the president, and they can't give it to him now.
That's right.
And she's holding the purse strings.
So, as you know, negotiation takes a willingness on both sides. You and I are both married. If we think that we can get 100% in a negotiation with our wives, we're crazy. If we get 30%, I know your wife. If you get 25%,
I get 10%, baby.
So, I mean, that Nancy Pelosi has come out and said, I'm going to give you not more than $1 for the wall. And President Trump has said, listen, I'm willing to negotiate. I want $5.7 billion for border security, but let's talk. Maybe there's a different number that works for you. Maybe we can bring in some DACA. But you can't negotiate with someone who doesn't want to negotiate with you. So yes, we can find a compromise, but you can't compromise with people who don't want to sit at the table and they want to bludgeon you. So
Nancy Pelosi says this is an immoral wall. The wall is immoral itself.
What's immoral is that women are being sexually assaulted on this trip, that people are dying, that Officer Singh was killed as an officer in California from an illegal immigrant. Listen, I heard the Democrats talk about, migrants commit less crimes than non-migrants, American citizens. I don't know about the facts of that, but I'll tell you what, if you come into our country, I want no one to commit a crime. And if you have a criminal record, you don't belong here. And if you have a criminal record and you come in and commit more crimes, shame on us for not securing our border. Officer Singh should still be alive, and countless others. And to say that it's a manufactured crisis when you have real families who will never see their children again, or their father again, or their spouse again, we have a duty to say, hey, listen, we're open. Let people come into our country, but good people who want to work, they want to live the American dream, but we should also have an assessment process so we can keep the bad ones out, Raymond.
Okay, on Thursday, the president went to the border to make his case. He was there in McAllen, Texas. On Wednesday, he met with Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. After the meeting, he tweeted this out. Just left a meeting with Chuck and Nancy, a total waste of time. I asked what's going to happen in 30 days if I quickly open things up. Are you going to approve border security, which includes a wall and steel barrier? Nancy said, no. I said, bye-bye. Nothing else works. Your reaction?
You know what? It just goes to show you that Democrats are not being honest players as we negotiate with them. They're saying, yeah, open up the government, Mr. President, and we'll negotiate. But they made it very clear they're not willing to negotiate with the president. And so, listen.
It's worse than that. Chuck Schumer said this, and I want your reaction to this. Chuck Schumer came out of that White House meeting. He said this on Wednesday.
He asked Speaker Pelosi, will you agree to my wall? She said no. And he just got up and said, then we have nothing to discuss, and he just walked out. Again, we saw a temper tantrum because he couldn't get his way, and he just walked out of the meeting. I asked him to open up the government, that tomorrow so many people will have trouble paying their mortgages, paying their bills, dealing with situations when they don't get paid.
How long can you keep this government closed with 800,000 workers, federal workers on furlough? I got to say, though, the traffic in D.C. is fantastic.
So, listen, Raymond, you have to admit that this is real hard for real Americans.
For these federal workers, they live paycheck to paycheck.
Absolutely.
Some of them are not, they don't have the means to pay this.
Absolutely.
So there's real pressure here, human pressure.
And so it's incumbent upon Nancy Pelosi to sit down and negotiate a deal. And I think I've heard from some Democrat senators who say, listen, this is untenable. We can't keep our position at $1 when the president's willing to negotiate. And I'll tell you, most Americans might be a tick right of center or a tick left of center, but we all analyze fairness. And they want people to be fair in the negotiation. And I think Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are losing because there's a perception that they're not being fair. They're not being honest brokers in the negotiation. And so I think the blame is going to come to them. And I mean, in Wisconsin, I don't know if you recall, Scott Walker was our governor. He went through a recall process. Scott Walker got more votes in the recall. My parents are Democrats. Didn't vote for him in any of his elections, but they voted for him in the recall because they said what Democrats were doing in the recall was unfair. I think Americans will say, you're not being fair. Sit down, negotiate, Nancy and Chuck, and open up the government.
And the polls show a plurality of Americans want that border dealt with. They believe there's a border crisis, 42%.
And that's with all of the media, ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, all fighting with Democrats to message to the American people that Democrats are right and Trump is wrong, and still a plurality agree with the president. That's stunning at how right the president is.
8 Republicans peeled off. You all had some procedural votes the other day. 8 Republicans peeled off, but then I think it was 8 Democrats who also crossed the aisle and voted. Is this the beginning of the fracturing of the Republican unity on this? President says everybody's unified. Is that what you're seeing?
So we had a meeting a few nights ago with the Vice President. Kellyanne came, Secretary Nielsen came. And as we sat in the room and listened to the stats on the border, and how important border security is, I think that our conference is unified. But let's be clear on one thing, Raymond. Democrats control the House, and it's a majority institution. So they can pass whatever they want. We don't have any control. But in the Senate, Republicans do control the Senate, but they have this 60-vote rule. There's 100 senators. You have to get 60 votes, which means you need 7 Democrats to vote with you. So you have to be more bipartisan in the Senate.
Yeah, but on any vote, Mitch McConnell can engage the nuclear option, which the president is asking for.
And I've asked him too.
Which
and
would be
House members have asked him as well.
Which would just be 51 votes.
Well, and we could have done that before Nancy Pelosi took control of the House. Now that she's in control, it's hard to get a bill that's reasonable over to the Senate that he could invoke the nuclear
Was that
option.
a failure on the part of Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell when they had both the reins of government? They should they have gotten the funding for the wall then? Was that a mistake?
Well, they always saw the problem that could they pass it in the Senate? But you know what? To try at the very end seems a little bit cheap. We should have been trying for 2 years to get the money to fund the wall. It would have been hard, but it wouldn't have been any harder than what we're going through right now.
Right.
And, you know, it was great we got tax reform done. But you know what? We should have had a broader infrastructure package that Democrats support. And part of that infrastructure, you slide in your $5 billion for the wall. Everyone would have been a winner. People are going back to work. We have new airports, new bridges, new roads. It would have been great. I think we missed an opportunity.
Let me ask this question. The president is asking for $5 billion for the wall. But he's asking for $5 billion, it seems to me, over the same appropriation of $5 billion for 4 years.
Right.
He wants $20 billion.
So right.
To build the wall.
Originally, he wanted $25 billion.
Right.
So you can't spend all $20 billion in 1 year. So he said, okay, I can spend $5.7 billion a year over 4 years to complete this project to secure our border. And you're right. So you're going to need different appropriations throughout the time frame.
Yeah.
But I mean, what I find interesting is people say, well, walls are a 4th century tool.
17th century solution.
Well, we're using 17th century modes of transportation. People are walking like they did hundreds of years ago, and they work, and you can help funnel people into different points of entry so you can better assess them.
Is this declaring, the threat is he's going to declare a national emergency and get the military, use military funds and the military to build the wall. Is that a trap for the president?
You know,
Some commentators have said he'll hit the tripwire of exceeding his powers and engage an impeachment process.
Well, I don't know that it'll engage in an impeachment process. What I do is I want to look over the horizon, and let's say we have President Elizabeth Warren, and she says we also have a crisis, and it's global warming, and I'm going to use the same authority that the president did for the wall. And guess what? We're going to impose new sanctions, new taxes on the American people to protect us from climate change or global warming. Be careful what you do today, because they may use that same authority, when they have the presidency. And so we got to be cautious on how we navigate this.
Yeah. And President Obama already exceeded
his authority.
Some of his authorities with the DACA kids, with some of the other things that he was doing, just kind of willy-nilly. Now the courts have come down on his side, however. So it's broadened the presidential authority, which I agree with you. I think that's a bad idea. I like a check and balance. Otherwise, the people have no voice.
And we're on a Catholic show, right? As we talk about walls, and if we look at the Vatican, what does the Vatican have around it?
Well, I heard a commentator on CNN the other day, whom I won't mention, say, but there's a big door. It's totally open in the middle.
And there's guards there.
No, it's not. You can't walk in. It's complete. The leaning it goes all the way around, and there are 2 entrances: one to the Papal Palace, one through the Ark of the Bells. There are guards there, and there are gates.
That's right.
You don't get in. In fact, I often tell
because they work.
Go walk through those gates and try to sit there with your family or get health care or a meal. See what happens.
Bring a tent too and see how it works for you. I mean, because the walls work. And again, I just want to close. We're compassionate. We want to help people out. But wouldn't it be better, Raymond, if we said, you know what, why don't you apply, at the American Embassy in your home country? If you get access, you can fly here, not take this long journey. You don't get sexually assaulted. You might not lose your life. It's a way more compassionate policy to secure the border and have a methodical, orderly process where people can come in, they can apply, and if they get it, they get here. But what we're doing to Central Americans is, I think, unfathomable when you talk about morality. This is the most immoral immigration platform that we have that incentivizes people to go on this journey with kids and sometimes pregnant women.
Endanger them.
It really is a sad state of affairs, and we're better than what we're doing right now.
My big concern has always been, if you've gone to the border, as I have, and you've seen and talked to these families, the first thing you realize is they are coming here, they want a better life,
They do.
but by allowing them to come in this way, they're used on this side of the border by business interests that want to commodify them. And they're really shunned and consigned to a certain class that they can't break out of due to a language barrier, education barrier, on and on and on. We need an orderly process and a compassionate one that gives these people their human dignity in the process coming in and once they come into America. This is no way to treat anybody.
And one last point, we have full employment right now, and we need workers. And so Democrats will say, bring them in and help fill the jobs that are available today. Fair point. But this economy will turn at one point. And when it does, and Americans start to lose their job, all of a sudden the low-skill, lower-income Americans are going to be competing, like you mentioned, to lower-paid illegal immigrants. And it hurts our families. And that's why we have to really think through the long-term consequences of these policies and make it better for our country and make it better for the migrant.
Good conversation. Thank
Raymond,
you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We'll stay in touch and see you in the days ahead. Joining me now is the CEO of Schwartz Investment Counsel and the portfolio manager for the Ave Maria Mutual Funds. He's also author of a brand new book, In God We Trust, Morally Responsible Investing. Welcome back to the program, Jorge Schwartz. George, great to see you.
Great to be with you again,
I want
Raymond.
to start with some new statistics that were just released. I saw CNS News said the Republican Congress has increased the national debt by nearly $8 trillion over 8 years. How is that fiscally responsible?
Well, it's not really, Raymond, and it'd be nice if Republican Congress and Democrat Congresses could balance the budget. But as Richard Nixon said many years ago, we're all Keynesians now, which means bigger government spending, more taxation, and it's unfortunate. But President Trump is turning that around to some degree, especially with the tax rate cuts, and the reduced regulations, which were so onerous, put in place by the Obama administration, of course. And my friend Larry Kudlow, has been preaching for many years that tax rate cuts on corporations and individuals stimulates the economy, grows the economy, and is positive in every respect. And that's helped a lot in the last 2 years. And the stock market has reflected that by going up.
Yeah, let's talk about this question of debt for a second. CNBC talked to millennials. 60% of them said they doubt if they will ever get to the point when they'll be able to pay off what they owe. What do you say to these young people who might be watching?
It's a tough question. I don't have an answer. I don't have a magic solution. I've preached for many years the evils of debt, personal debt especially. And I encourage my employees to not even have a mortgage on their house. Just pay off debts. But these kids that have borrowed, some cases, $100,000 to go to college.
Or more.
Or more, yeah. And it's not a good thing. And they've got to just do the best they can to pay it down. And if they invest wisely, if they have some money to invest, like in our mutual funds, that might help them too.
Well, let's talk about that. And because I want to get to more tax rates for a minute. So many people, the old wisdom was, take your money, put it in the bank, it's going to grow. That penny saved is a penny earned, and it's going to continue to block. That's not the case now. We have these interest rates that are in the toilet, 2% on your money. What would you recommend a young married couple starting life? They don't have a lot, and they probably have debts they're paying off. What should they do? How should they break down their money?
Well, Warren Buffett had a quote several years ago, which I remember. He said, the Lord helps those who help themselves, but unlike the Lord, the market doesn't forgive those who know not what they do. Got to get that quote right. But anyways, it's people have to educate themselves. They have to learn the merits of capitalism, the merits of democracy, which is very important within our capitalist society, at least in this country. And if they read my book, they'll learn a good way to invest, morally responsible investing.
And we're going to talk about that in a second. I want to get your opinion. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez waived the possibility this week of a 70% tax rate to fund her new Green New Deal, and where you'd have no carbon emissions at all. You'd pay all of that off, and the only way to do that is to tax upper income earners at 70%. What's wrong with that idea?
Oh, what a great idea that is! I just can't think of anything which would help the economy better.
When you're looking to empower government, it's a good idea.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether she is just naive and too young to have not been able to experience the horrors of socialism or not, or maybe she's in the camp with a lot of Democrats that just want to do things to hurt the economy and hurt the stock market with the hopes of stymieing Trump from getting reelected. But it's a ridiculous idea. You know, the top 1% of earners now pay 38% of the income taxes.
Right.
The top 50% pay virtually all the income taxes, 98%. Right. Which means the lower 50% pay 2% of the income taxes. Yeah. But trying to undo the good things that President Trump has done is the wrong idea in terms of being pro-growth.
I read an article in the Washington Post this week, and it said Ocasio-Cortez's idea is not so far off the mark. In the 50s and 60s, we had tax rates that were around 70% and higher. So what's wrong with that?
It's ridiculous. It stymies economic growth, it stymies opportunity. It is not a pro-growth approach. And President Trump's very sound policy of reduced tax rates for corporations and individuals, and importantly, reduced regulations, helps the economy in so many respects.
You talk in your book about the fascination of socialism. It really has become chic again to be socialist. Yeah. Where do you think this is coming from? Is it just ignorance?
Well, it's certainly ignorance and lack of education among young people. You know, the colleges and universities, as you well know, Raymond, are taught, have professors who were the flower children of the 60s, you know, the drug-smoking hippies. And they dominate the universities, the public universities anyways. And they have never grown to appreciate the merits of capitalism and how capitalism has lifted so many hundreds of people, maybe billions of people out of poverty, created jobs, created opportunities, created wealth, created the opportunity for foundations and endowments, which do an awful lot of social good. And socialism has never worked in the history of the world, no matter any place it's been tried.
In this new book, George, In God We Trust, you say this is an updated version, or you started it as an update of your previous book, Good Returns. What's changed in your approach and from the previous work to this?
Yeah, well, this was going to be an update of the very successful Ave Maria Mutual Funds and the morally responsible investing approach we used to produce those good results. But thanks to the advice and counsel of my colleague and son, Bob Schwartz, he said, why don't you expand the focus and include sections about capitalism versus socialism? Because there's so many young people and so many liberals that, as you pointed out, are being attracted to it. And it's ridiculous. It's never worked. It can't work. The great Ronald Reagan, once said that socialism can only work in two places. Heaven where they don't need it, and in hell where they already have it.
Well, I mean, or Venezuela or Cuba. I mean, it's not like we don't have contemporary examples of how this plays out.
Exactly.
And it's very bad for the people. It's why they're all streaming, trying to get somewhere else. It's why your heart breaks watching these people make this long, dangerous trek to America. But this is the fruit of this system. It doesn't work. Tell me about, when you talk about morally responsible investing, how do you weigh these companies? How do you say this company is one we'll invest in and that is off limits? What's the criteria?
Well, we're very blessed as portfolio managers. My company has a Catholic advisory board to advise us on what not to invest in. And that Catholic advisory board is made up of prominent lay Catholics. Many of them you know, many of them are your friends, like Tom Monahan of Domino's Pizza fame, Robbie George, Professor Robert George from Princeton, and Coach Lou Holtz.
Lou Holtz, a great man, such a great man.
Wonderful individual, yeah. A very compassionate man, a very bright man, very patriotic man. So that Catholic Advisory Board is also advised by two distinguished members of the clergy, the retired Archbishop of Detroit, Cardinal Maida, and the current Archbishop of Detroit, Archbishop Vigneron. So they set the standard for what we should not invest in. And I can tell you
Yeah,
what
give me
categories
the quick. Yeah, give me the quick
Okay.
thumbnail. What don't you invest in? I mean, let me give you, for instance, tobacco companies.
It's not prohibited.
Not prohibited.
Right.
Oil, I assume, would be
Not
fine.
prohibited.
But companies that traffic in porn, I imagine, or
Porn is out.
abortion.
Abortion. Abortion's a big one. Our 100,000 shareholders are unanimous that they don't want any of their money invested in a company that supports abortion.
What about cannabis? Cannabis is a big, booming industry. You see them legalizing it all over the country, and people are throwing billions of dollars at it.
Yeah, we're not going to invest in cannabis companies. You know, gateway drug, nothing good is going to come from the legalization of recreational pot. No. So our shareholders don't want that. We're not going to go in that
How do
direction.
your returns compare to an average mutual fund?
All 5 of our Ave Maria Mutual Funds beat the category average for each fund last year. In fact, one of our funds, the Ave Maria Bond Fund, was the #1 fund in the country in its category. So we're very proud of that.
Wow. Give me a sense, and you've got a lot of people watching, they're wondering, I don't know where to start. What are your advice bullet points to the first-time investor who's thinking, the volatility of this market is scary. And it's gone up, 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 up. And you know if it goes up, there's only one way it's going to go.
Yeah.
So they're sitting it out. What would you say to them?
A lot of people are sitting it out, and if they're serious long-term investors, they ought to invest now. There's nothing wrong with it. The great Sir John Templeton used to say, any day is a good enough day to buy a good enough stock or a good enough mutual fund. And I think the Ave Maria Mutual Funds are great mutual funds, and they've performed well. I think they're going to continue to perform well, and I'm optimistic about the economy in general, the stock market in general. And
even with all the trade battles, even with the divided Congress, you're bullish on this market.
Yes, those things will pass. These things too will pass. And trade's an important thing to get straight, and get the Chinese to stop stealing our intellectual property. Very, very important. But those things will pass. Those will be resolved. And in the meantime, corporate profits continue to go up quite sharply. This past year, they're up 24%.
Except for Apple.
Not as much there. But even in this current year, earnings are going to be up again, probably in the neighborhood of 8 or 10%, not 24%. But after 24%, 8% or 10% on top of that is significant.
Yeah.
And the stock market and corporate earnings generally track pretty close, not exactly, not step by step, but it's a strong economy, and the policies of President Donald Trump are helping the economy grow, and will continue to help the stock market, I believe.
George Schwartz, before I let you go, the biggest mistake investors make is what?
Trying to outguess the near-term swings in the stock market. Trying to say, well, gee, there's all these clouds on the horizon. I better take my money out of the stock market and wait till things become a little more clear. Well, when things are clear, the stock prices are already a lot higher. So don't try to time the market. Don't try to outguess the near-term swings in the market, and invest for the long run, and invest in get good advice from investment professionals like the people who work in my firm. And if you invest in a morally responsible way, I think you'll do very well over the long term.
Are there fees for getting into a mutual fund like yours?
Many mutual funds have fees, front-end loads, back-end loads.
Back-end loads, yeah.
Ours don't have that. They have a normal management fee, which comes out of the fund itself. But no, when someone puts $1,000 into one of our funds, all $1,000 goes into it. There's no commissions or no front-end load.
Very good. George Schwartz, thank you so much. The book is In God We Trust, Morally Responsible Investing by George Schwartz. It's available at bookstores everywhere and online. And you can find out about Ave Maria Mutual Funds at avemariafunds.com. That is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. You can like me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. And remember, Book 3 of The Adventures of Will Wilder is out next month. Will Wilder, The Amulet of Power, hits bookstores on February 19th. You can pre-order your copy right now at the usual outlets. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.